Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the last week, the 9th week of my 8-week series on biblical archaeology. Thank you. If you want to come up afterwards, I've got in order here the handouts from every week, starting back in week 1. But we've been looking through the Bible, going more or less in the order of the Bible, looking at archaeology, archaeological findings that go along with what we read in the Bible. And so we started talking about events in Genesis. We started talking about actually the flood. And I'm just looking over, we worked our way through events in Genesis, the patriarchs, Exodus. We looked at the kingdom of Israel. And the last 2 weeks last week we started looking at archaeology of the New Testament. And so for today, the final week, I'm going to get into that. You can see on the handout in front of you, it says, well, there's my name, my email address, if you ever have any questions. And it says hillsidegreek.wordpress.com. And I finally got them up last night, links to these lectures. I video them, and so, I was about to say videotape, but we don't use tape anymore. I video them, and so they're on YouTube, and you can find links to them at that website. And I've gotten up through lesson 6, which means I'm behind by 2. And in 40 minutes, I'll be behind by 3, but that's pretty good. Okay, so let's get started. The first few minutes will just be things that I didn't get into last week. So let's talk about the historian Tacitus. Again, what I'm looking at is, as we read through the Bible, and we read these stories that we know from the Bible, and we want to see what outside of the Bible, outside of Christian writings, do we see corroboration of what's in the New Testament. So there's the historian Tacitus. He wrote in AD 115 about that Nero had persecuted the Christians. As I forgot, there's a book I was supposed to bring, but I didn't bring it. Oh well, okay, I'll just do it off the top of my head. I was supposed to bring my copy of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. Oh well, it's sitting on my desk. Okay, so he wrote that Nero had persecuted Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for Rome's Great Fire in the year 64. Now what's interesting is that Tacitus wrote, and here's the part where I read to you a page from The Case for Christ, but I'll just kind of do it from memory here. Tacitus wrote that these Christians were being persecuted. He said that an immense multitude had held so strongly to their belief in this person Jesus, believing that he was God. They sang to him as if he was God. And it's interesting that this is it's an important testimony because it's an unsympathetic witness, meaning Tacitus was definitely not a Christian or sympathetic to the Christian cause, so this would not be Christian propaganda. But Tacitus was writing about the success and the spread of Christianity, that it was based on a historical figure named Jesus who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. It's also significant that Tacitus was writing that these people believed that Jesus was God, that it was an immense multitude who would were willing to die rather than recant their beliefs. So the reason I think this is important is because I've heard through the years a lot of people say, well, the belief that Jesus performed miracles, that he was God, this is just mythology that develops in the 4th century and 5th century and later on. So it's important to see that within a few decades of Jesus' life, we have witness and testimony that people back then believed that he was God, that he performed miracles. Now the next fellow I want to talk about is Hadrian. He was emperor of Rome from 117 to 138. So now we're looking at about a century after Jesus' life and his crucifixion and resurrection. Now Hadrian is most famous for building the wall. He built Hadrian's Wall. In 122, Hadrian initiated construction of this wall, and you can see a map in England. So the Roman Empire spread up throughout Europe and into England, and it's there right south of Scotland. It was built to, quote, separate the Romans from the barbarians, according to a book called Historia Augusta. It deterred attacks on Roman territory at a lower cost than one idea that he could have had a border patrol there. He could have just had the army massed against the border, but it was just a cheaper cost just to build a wall there. And it controlled cross-border trade and immigration. Now, so this is what Hadrian is most famous for. This has nothing to do with the Bible, but Hadrian's most famous for Hadrian's Wall. Now, what he has to do with the Bible is that Hadrian detested Christianity. He wanted to wipe out any memory of Christianity, any history of Christianity. And so he took many sacred Christian places, and he built shrines over them. One such example being the Pool of Bethesda. Basically, he built shrines to Roman and Greek gods over these Christian places. Interestingly, so archaeologists, do you need another copy? Okay. Archaeologists, when they're looking for where is this sacred Christian place or this place, like maybe the home where Peter lived or different places, archaeologists know to look for Hadrian shrines. So Hadrian shrines, the things that he built to other gods, actually tell archaeologists good places to look. Because Hadrian's put these shrines all over the place, specifically, basically, to bury Christian sites.
John?
Yes?
Is that wall still standing today?
Yes.
Yes. It is. I don't know. I can't even remember what form it's in. Shannon, you've seen it? Or?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
There's places
You've seen
it's
it. Okay.
pretty much intact.
Is it still tall or anything? Or?
Some places.
Okay.
Like how tall?
Not real tall, 10 feet, 15 feet. And then they had, like, kind of like the wall in China or whatever, they had watch tower,
Turrets,
lookouts along the wall. And then they could travel their armies up and down the wall. It was wide enough that they...
The fat wall.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So one such place related to Hadrian is the what's called the Church of Nativity. Now, it is believed that we know the place where Jesus was born. And the reason we think we know these places is that even though Hadrian was trying to get rid of them, Constantine came along in the 4th century, and he wanted to build up and preserve these sacred places. So in the place where it was believed at that time that Jesus was born, in about the 320s, Emperor Constantine had built a church around it. Basically, it's called the Church of Nativity. Hadrian had previously, 2 centuries earlier, turned it into a shrine to the Greek god Adonis. So Constantine said, okay, we know this shrine to Greek god Adonis. What my predecessor did was wrong, so let's get rid of that and let's turn it back into what it should be. It should be a Christian, it is a Christian thing. So they find, archaeologically, they find mangers that are carved out of stone. In the year 326, Emperor Constantine and his mother, her name was Saint Helena, commissioned a church to be built over this area. And the church was dedicated in the year 339. Now, there are portions of a floor mosaic. I don't have pictures here, I don't think. Do I? No. Pictures of a floor mosaic that survived from this period. We have Saint Jerome, and he was the one who copied who basically translated the Bible into Latin. Back in the 4th century, people read Latin, so Saint Jerome translated the Bible for them. And he lived and worked in Bethlehem at this time, in about the 380s. And he was actually buried in a cave beneath the Church of the Nativity. Now, the church has had a rough history. So it started out, of course, where Jesus was born. And then before it was a church, Hadrian built a shrine to Adonis. Constantine then had a Christian church built over it. Then the church was destroyed by Justinian in the year 530. So we're fast forwarding 2 centuries. And he actually, not that he didn't like it, but he actually built a much larger church that remains there today. So Justinian said, this church won't do, let's build a bigger church around it. The Persians came in and attacked and ransacked the place in the year 614. so about a century after Justinian. And so they did some great damage, or they started to do some great damage, but then when they got in there, the legend says that they were so impressed. Remember, the whole point of this church was that it preserves where Jesus was born. And there were pictures all around of the Magi who came and visited. Well, the Persians were so impressed by the representations of the Magi that they said, let's not destroy this place because this is a pretty cool place after all. So they left it mostly untouched. So anyway, that's the Church of the Nativity. And again, it's a big church that's been built that is, we think, over the place where Jesus was born. Okay. Any questions on that? Good, because that's all I know. Okay. Next. Celsus. He wrote in the late 2nd century, and he wrote the first comprehensive attacks on Christianity. He was like the original Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. So he wrote this book. It's called The True Word, and it was basically an attack on Christianity. But the things that he wrote were interesting to me. He wrote, for example, and again, this is a guy who was out to smear and attack Christianity in the 2nd century. He wrote that Jesus invented the idea of the virgin birth. He wrote that Jesus went to Egypt and learned magic, sorcery, from the Egyptians, that then he brought back to his home. He wrote that Jesus proclaimed himself to be God. We don't have any intact copies of Celsus's work, but we do have people writing about his work and quoting him. Now, why is this important? Well, it is important because it's a hostile witness to Christianity from the 2nd century. Now, a hostile witness is a wonderful thing to have when it supports your case. It corroborates the stories of the virgin birth and Jesus' miracles. And again, sometimes you'll read today that those stories didn't develop till later in the 4th century or 5th century. But here we have Celsus in the 2nd century writing that these things were, he's not saying that they took place, but just confirming that they were believed. So it is also interesting to me that Celsus did not deny the miracles of Jesus. He did not write in his attack on Christianity, he did not say, the Christians believe Jesus performed these miracles, but that's not true. What he wrote is that Jesus went to Egypt and learned sorcery and magic. So he was confirming that Jesus performed these miracles. He didn't attribute it to the right cause, but he was confirming that Jesus performed these miracles. He was confirming the virgin birth, confirming that Jesus proclaimed himself to be God, and that the Christians believed himself to be God. So his is an important hostile witness to Christianity early on. Okay, I'm on page 2 now of the handout. People often accuse Christians and say, well, you believe all those fairy tales in the Bible, but we don't know anything about Jesus. So let's pretend we didn't have the Bible at all. What do we know from non-Christian writings, just from historians outside of Christianity? Without the Bible, what would we be able to conclude about Jesus just looking at ancient non-Christian sources like Josephus, like Tacitus, Josephus I talked about last week, like Celsus, and all these other writers? Well, here's some things. First of all, I didn't even list this, but I didn't even think to list it. Jesus actually lived. Sometimes the smart people on the internet, you see people writing, well, Jesus didn't actually live, he's just been invented. Now, no historian ever would say that, but the smart people on the internet, in the YouTube comments sometimes. Okay, so beyond that Jesus actually lived, we get from non-Christian writings in history that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, that many people believe that he performed healings and exorcisms, that some believed he was the Messiah, that he was rejected by Jewish leaders, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, that despite his shameful death, which is a crucifixion, his followers who believed that he was still alive spread beyond Palestine so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by the year 64. And that many people, all sorts of people from the cities and countryside, this would be men, women, slaves, and free, worshipped him as God. And so those are things that we don't necessarily have to learn from the Bible. Those are things that we learn just from history. Okay, any questions? All right. Are there enough handouts to go around? Or?
There's one more right here.
Okay. Does anybody need a handout? Okay. Good to go. All right. Okay, the house of Jesus in Nazareth. So the house that he grew up in. Archaeologists have uncovered actually two houses, and they're not quite sure. There's some debate over which one, but they're pretty sure that one of these two is probably where Jesus grew up. They found these two houses where in both of them, the inhabitants of them obeyed Moses, the law of the Torah, Mosaic law. And they can just tell that by the things, the artifacts they find in the house. Both houses were abandoned in the 1st century AD. One house had a church built around it in the 5th century. So of these two houses, at least people in the 5th century assumed that it was Jesus' house. And so they built a church around it. But there is a bit of speculation, but they think they've narrowed it down to one of two houses where Jesus grew up. Then there was a house of Peter in Capernaum. Now this is in the city of Capernaum where Jesus stayed. You can read, it's mentioned in Matthew 8, verses 5 and 14. I won't read that. But you see a picture, and there's this octagonal structure. And I think the octagonal structure was built later on. You can read in the story that Jesus came out of the synagogue, and he went to Peter's house. And I think there, Peter was his mother-in-law. She had a fever, and Jesus healed her. But in the story you read, Jesus came out of the synagogue and went to Peter's house. Well, they have that synagogue preserved, and it's actually like right next door to it. So it's not he traveled a long way. It's neat that archaeologists and I guess visitors can go, I've never been there, but can be at the synagogue and then walk, I think less than like 50 yards or something. You've been there?
Uh-huh.
Okay, and go to Peter's house. So cool.
It's close.
How close? Right next door?
No, it's not next door.
Okay.
It's just kind of around the corner.
Okay. The 7-Eleven. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's neat. Now, for much of his adult life, Jesus resided in this small fishing village of Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. And it was here that he began his ministry in the town synagogue. He recruited his first disciples, and you can read all of this in Mark 1. And he became renowned for his power to heal the sick. And you can read about that through the beginning of Mark, up through Mark 3. If you look on page 3, the 1st century fishing boat. So we read stories about Jesus going in the fishing boat, and there was a storm, and there was the walking on water. During a drought year, they found buried beneath the remains of a Byzantine church, excavators found the ruins of a dwelling dating to the 1st century BC. I'm sorry. I'm reading through my notes what I said. That was Peter's house. Let's go to the fishing boat. Okay, they found it during the drought year. There I am. This fishing boat encased in mud, and it held between 12 and 15 people. So they think that this picture that you see is the remains of the kind of fishing boat. They're not saying it was one that Jesus was on, but this is the kind of fishing boat they had back then. And Josephus also wrote about the size and the shape of these. So I think that's kind of neat. Another place that has been found, Jacob's well. Now you can read the story about Jacob asking the Samaritan woman for some water in John 4, 5 through 6. And actually, let me read it right here. So he, meaning Jesus, came to a town in Samaria called Sychar. Near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. Now, so Jacob had this plot of ground, gave it to his son Joseph. This particular well was not specifically mentioned in Genesis. We only read about it then in in the Gospels. It was mentioned by a writer, Eusebius, in the 14th century. And it still stands and is in use today. It's protected by a church that's been built around it. So this is where Jesus asked the Samaritan woman for a drink and offered her living water. It's in the crypt of a modern Greek Orthodox church at a town called Nablus, which is right between Nazareth and Jerusalem, about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. There is a masonry structure that surrounds, I don't have a picture of it, a masonry structure that surrounds the mouth of the well, and on it stands a metal-framed pulley with a coil of rope long enough to reach the water. A neck section about half a meter across and 1.2 meters deep opens into the shaft that's about 2.5 meters in diameter that's in the solid rock. And so if you go there, you can actually drink from this well. Has anybody in here drunk from the well? No? Okay. Okay, so anyway, I've run into some people who have actually drunk from this well. You can enter this church, you can pull up water, and sounds like a neat thing. You happen to be in the area. A depth of more than 40 meters. The Samaritan woman told Jesus the well is deep, and measurements of the depth vary over the years due to some accumulation from debris, and I think some tourists that occasionally throw rocks in there. But a depth of more than 40 meters was recorded in 1935, and they say it's been reduced to about 20 meters. So I guess in less than a century, a lot of tourists have thrown stones.
A lot of pennies in there.
Yeah, a lot of pennies. I don't know. And they think that in ancient times, the well was sunk much deeper, maybe even twice as deep as the 40 meters. And there's been times that Jacob's Well has been totally dry in the summer. But it's a place you can drink the water. Never been there. All right, any questions on that? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead to talk about Jesus' trial. Josephus mentions the high priest Annas. There were actually two high priests at the time. There was Annas and Caiaphas. And sometimes people say, well, there's this high priest mentioned in the Bible, or there's this one. How could there be two high priests? Well, that's exactly it. There were two high priests at the time. It was a dispute between basically the Roman Empire that ruled the whole land and the Israelites, the Jews, who they wanted to be their own people. And so the Mosaic law, Moses' law, says that a high priest is appointed for life. So the Jews, they had their procedure for appointing a high priest. But the Roman government was also being in charge of everything. They said, no, we're going to appoint your high priest for you. And so there were two high priests. One that the Roman government gave them, non-separation of church and state right here. The Roman government gave them a high priest, and they had their own high priest. So there were two high priests. And so Caiaphas was the acting high priest in AD 18 through 36. So he was, I believe, he would have been the one that the Jews said, this is our high priest. Other people mentioned, let's see, and Caiaphas was the one who organized a plot to kill Jesus. We also know, historically, we have writings about Pontius Pilate. He was a Roman governor, a prefect of Roman Judea, and he served from about 26 to 36. And we see that he is written about by historians like Philo, Tacitus, and Josephus. In archaeology, we find some of these places that are written about. If you read the stories of Jesus' trials, and I'm not going to read this here, but you go home and read, for example, in John 19, you read about where Pontius Pilate brought him out in front of the people. There's the praetorium and a stone pavement leading up to this that we find archaeologically. I didn't get any pictures for you because I couldn't find any that I thought would reproduce well on the cheap black and white photos that I'm giving you. But you can look these up, you can Google search these on the internet, and you can find where the trial was. You can find these things. There's something called a bema, which is basically the judgment seat, and I think maybe some translations of the Bible use that word bema. Matthew 27:19 in some translations. where Pontius Pilate, I think it was him, sat on this judgment seat. And they actually found this in the 1970s. So we can find these artifacts and these structures where he was tried.
John,
Yes.
going back to the high priest that the Romans appointed,
Yes.
was it, which one of the two was it?
I believe Annas was the one that was appointed by the Roman government. Caiaphas was the one who the Jews said, this is our high priest. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, another artifact that we find is what's called the James ossuary. The James ossuary, which is basically not so much a coffin, but where just a container where the bones are held of James. And there's a Hebrew inscription on it that says, in Hebrew, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And so it is believed that these are the bones of James, the brother of Jesus Christ. Now, if we, one thing we can think about is, so you find this container of bones, and it says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And one thing to be properly skeptical about is, what are the odds that this is actually James, Jesus' brother? And so what we would want to statistically look at is, how many people in this area at that time would have been named James? Furthermore, how many of them would have been the son of Joseph, just looking at statistically? And how many of them would have had a brother named Jesus? And so it's figured that statistically, there would probably be fewer than 2 people, which means 1 person. That's how we talk in statistics. Fewer than 2. I'm a mathematician, it works for me. So fewer than 2. There would be 1.8 people, let's say that distinction, that designation would go to in first century Jerusalem. So it is believed that this is James, his brother. Also, it is indirectly a first century attestation of Jesus being a prominent person. Generally speaking, and you think about if what do you want on your tombstone now? Generally on your tombstone or on an ossuary like this, it would say who he's the son of, because that we have last names now, so we don't have to say who we're the son of. But then that it says brother of Jesus. Why would you mention that? Why would that be mentioned unless that at the time this Jesus who you're the brother of is a very, very prominent person? So we do believe we have the bones and the container, the ossuary of James, his brother. Okay, the crucifixion. Archaeologically, archaeologists have found that there was crucifixion at this time. They particularly have the body of a fellow named Yehohanan, who was crucified sometime before the year AD 70. And they found through his heel bone a nail, a 7-inch nail. Josephus wrote about Pontius Pilate and that Jesus was crucified. We have a writing by a Stoic philosopher named Mara bar Serapion. He wrote a letter in the year 73. So, keep in mind the timeline. This would have been a bit more than 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion. He wrote about the execution of, quote, the wise king of the Jews. Now, he doesn't mention Jesus specifically by name, but he does write about 40 years ago, the wise king of the Jews was crucified. It is the earliest non-Christian reference that we have to Jesus' crucifixion. Serapion wrote that even after the death of Jesus, Jesus' wisdom lives on. Now, I find that an interesting thing just to show that Serapion was not a Christian. He was not writing Christian propaganda. Why does what he wrote tell me that he wasn't a Christian? Because a Christian would not have written that even after Jesus was crucified, his wisdom lives on. That's what you write about a dead person, right? A Christian would have, at that time, and now believes that Christian lives on. If he were a Christian, he would have written that Jesus lives on. He is alive. But Serapion wrote, even though he's dead, his wisdom lives on. So That statement alone tells me that Serapion was not a Christian writing Christian propaganda. Okay. The tomb of Jesus, we have this. There is a church built around it. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I never pronounced that word right, sepulchre. Hadrian had built, so back to Hadrian again. Remember, he's the emperor who found Christian sites and said, let's wipe their memory away by building shrines to gods and goddesses. Well, archaeologists were looking for where do we have the tomb of Jesus? And fortunately, Hadrian pointed it right to us, because there is a double temple built to built to Jupiter and to Venus. So archaeologists said, this must be something big to Christians if Hadrian built a temple both to Jupiter and to Venus. And so they found that, that is the tomb of Jesus. Spoiler alert, it's empty. Okay. Okay. His resurrection. What do we know about his resurrection?
Is that where the Wailing Wall is?
No.
The Wailing Wall, I don't know the proximity. It's not right there at the site, and I don't know the proximity. I'm looking to the people who are world travelers.
It's a distance away. The tomb and the Wailing Wall are separated.
Okay, yeah.
It may also call the tomb. We don't know for sure if that is it or not. But
Right.
Catholics have taken a lot of this stuff and commercialized it, so it's so they can take you places and show you all these things.
Oh.
And a lot of them are proximities and stuff,
Right.
and say, this was kind of the area they were in.
Okay.
So, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
It's still interesting to go see it, because it does show you what it looked like or what it could have looked like.
Yeah.
So you have to use a little bit of thinking when you go to see it.
I understand, yes. All right. Okay, well, the last archaeological dig I'm going to tell you about, the resurrection. So there is something called the Nazareth inscription. Now, this is a writing that was, it's on stone, inscribed in stone, and it was acquired in Nazareth in 1870s. Acquired means, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was found on an antiquities market. Sometimes you go to a swap meet in the Middle East and you find that there are things that are, great treasures, great archaeological findings. I told you all last week about this very rare old New Testament manuscript that an archaeologist happened to come across on eBay. And he told the seller, don't sell it quite yet. Okay, so this was acquired in Nazareth in the 1870s. It is 22 lines in Greek. It is an edict from Caesar Claudius, Emperor Claudius, from about the year 41. So this would have been within about a decade of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. It calls for the death penalty for removing bodies from sealed tombs with wicked intent. That's what it says. It says it in Greek, but it's not that it's a crime to remove bodies from sealed tombs, but with wicked intent, whatever that means. Now, let's just read what's in the Bible here, and let's look at why Emperor Claudius wanted to issue this edict. So, starting in Matthew 28, I'll read, "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened." So keep in mind, just a little backup, Jesus has been crucified. They went to the tomb is empty, and here we are. "When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." Okay, so why did Claudius feel the need to make this command of death penalty? That is a pretty harsh penalty right there. Death penalty for removing the body from a sealed tomb with wicked intent. Because some body had been stolen from a sealed tomb, and it caused a lot of trouble. So, so this would be what we read about in the Bible. That Jesus' body, they alleged, had been stolen from the tomb, and there was a lot of trouble, and Emperor Claudius wanted to make it a severe crime. And if you can read Greek, there it is.
Can you read that?
Okay, I'm going to cheat here. I have trouble. I mean, it's such a bad photocopy right there. I can make out letters. I have here it typed in Greek, and I can more or less read that. Yes. Okay. More or less. I know that word. Okay. So that's all I have. Any questions? I'm kidding. Any questions for me?
If they had found the bones of James, you said, right?
Yes.
Have they done any DNA testing on that?
I'm not aware of that. I imagine probably yes. I can't imagine them giving up the opportunity to do that, so I'm going to guess yes, but I don't specifically know.
I was just wondering if someday they found a tomb that said this is Mary, mother of Jesus, and found bones, they could then do DNA research.
They can do that. I just don't know the extent of that. Yeah.
Well, at this point, there wouldn't be anything to compare it to.
No, not right now. How about the Shroud of Turin? Could they not get something off of that from Jesus?
I think they could, yeah. Oh, so you're looking for Jesus' DNA?
Yeah.
Given enough time and technology, maybe sometime, who knows. I know, well, I won't go into that. We'll see. We'll just have to see. Yeah. All right, so 9 weeks. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much, and thank you those of you who don't usually come, but I appreciate you coming. And that'll